I start to wonder and be aimless.
And that was one of the things the officials thought they saw something they didn't see.
The Super Bowl is the pinnacle of American sport. Over the course of a few hours, legacies are defined for players, teams, and at one point, even the NFL itself. But behind every team that's ever lost, there's sure to be a fan saying, that game was rigged. Most of the time, evidence is severely lacking in these scenarios, and no notable people involved ever come forth. But there are a select few conspiracies revolving around the nation's entertainment behemoth that do have some serious backers. Why do these people think these games were rigged? How could they have been fixed? Should we even believe in these conspiracies, or are they nothing more than a little controversy that adds to the lore of the league? This is the history behind those games and the accusations that come with them. Before we arrive at our first allegation of collusion, it's vital that we first understand the history behind it. By 1960, the NFL had been around for 4 decades and had managed to trounce or absorb any potential rival football leagues. So when the American Football League kicked off in 1960, it was seen as just another league that would come and go. It appeared the NFL had a monopoly on professional football. The AFL mainly got cast-off players who were misjudged and ready to prove that they were deserving of a pro career. Then the league started scouting small school players, predominantly black schools, which were largely skipped over by the NFL. And most importantly, the AFL landed a crucial TV deal with ABC, and years later a generous deal from NBC. This in return gave AFL teams more money to sign players. Back then, it was a bidding war on college football's best prospects. So over the next few years, the AFL was able to steal more and more highly rated prospects from the NFL. One of the most notable players was Alabama star quarterback Joe Namath, who was drafted by the NFL's St. Louis Cardinals and the AFL's New York Jets. He ended up signing with the Jets for the most expensive contract ever given to a college player at that time. This was one of the biggest contributing factors that led to the point where player salaries were increasing so fast that the two leagues decided on a merger, because ultimately the owners wanted to keep the money in their pockets. Art Modell, owner of the NFL's Cleveland Browns at the time, said, "Contracts like the one Namath got can be the ruination of the game." So in 1966, the two leagues agreed on a common draft of college football players to end the bidding war, as well as an AFL-NFL World Championship, which would later become known as the Super Bowl. After 3 Super Bowls, the plan was to fully merge into one single league with 2 conferences, because for the first 3 years, the two leagues would only meet in the championship. In 1967, we had our first Super Bowl. For the AFL, the Kansas City Chiefs absolutely dominated their league, going 11-2-1 and smashing the Buffalo Bills 31-7 in the AFL Championship game. Clearly, this was the team to beat out of the AFL, but they were still thought of as being far inferior to their NFL opponents, the Green Bay Packers, who went 12-2 and barely squeaked out a win against the Dallas Cowboys in the NFL Championship. In modern times, you would think both teams as dominant as this would be a great matchup, but the NFL was expected to win, and win big. The Packers were a 2-touchdown favorite and had all the pressure to show how the NFL was the better league. Although the Chiefs did play well in the beginning, the Packers ended up winning 35-10. The next year in Super Bowl II, the Packers beat the AFL's best Oakland Raiders 33-14, despite once again barely beating the Cowboys in the NFL Championship. This put the expectation into reality that the NFL Championship was bigger and better than the actual championship between the two leagues because the AFL seemed downright weaker. Now we've made it to January 1969. We have Super Bowl III between the AFL's New York Jets and the NFL's Baltimore Colts. That season, the 13-1 Colts had outscored their opponents by over 18 points a game. Man, these were NFL opponents. Most impressively, their only loss was to the Cleveland Browns, who they then shut out and blew out 34-0 in the NFL championship game. The 11-3 Jets were an underdog by over 2 touchdowns. Commissioner Pete Rozelle had to address the game beforehand, indicating that the league might be in for another shuffle of the deck, mainly with the playoff format itself, meaning this could be the final Super Bowl. The AFL was in desperate need of validating that it could compete with the NFL. Nobody wanted a league where one conference was full of teams that just couldn't compete with the other conference. An AFL win would drastically help interest from fans and increase money from future TV deals. Today, the Super Bowl is like a national holiday. It's by far the nation's biggest TV event of the year. Ads are sold for millions of dollars for the precious seconds companies can use to broadcast their products to over 100 million people. But there was doubt in 1969 that they would even have this game again if it went as predicted. However, if there were to be an upset, then it would be a story-making masterpiece. You got the high-profile New York Jets with one of the most famous and likely the sport's most marketable player in Joe Namath, who now is saying he guarantees a victory over a team being called the best of all time. Vince Lombardi, considered one of the best coaches of all time and of course has the Super Bowl trophy in his name, said the Jets' chances of winning this game were infinitesimal, which basically means zero chance. No matter what, millions of dollars were at stake, even for the Colts owner himself. Colts owner Carroll Rosenblum was described as a father figure to the team, and he even got many guys started in the business world when their football careers were over. Remember, these guys weren't even sniffing the millions of dollars that we see in today's contracts. Hall of Fame defensive end Gino Marchetti spoke very highly of Rosenblum, saying, "Outside of my parents, he probably did more to influence me than anyone else in my life." Former Colts running back Tom Matte also said, "For his loyalty to you, he demanded loyalty in return. If you got on his bad side, you were gone." And finally, former Chargers owner Gene Klein said, "He always gave you the feeling that if you crossed him, he was capable of slitting your throat, then donating your blood to the Red Cross blood drive." And according to former Colts business manager Burt Bell Jr., Rosenblum was an active gambler who wagered on his own team. Bell even said he left the team because he knew there would come a day when Rosenblum would have asked him to do something illegal. Legend has it that when the Colts went for a touchdown rather than a game-winning field goal in overtime of the 1958 championship game, it's because Rosenblum had bet on the Colts by winning more than 3 points. Rozelle and Rosenblum actually had a falling out over gambling rumors in the 1970s, but Rosenblum is said to have still been a key member of the league's inner circle. Maybe most notably, he helped Rozelle put together the rich TV contracts, which helped the sport take off. He also apparently had a secret deal to move the Colts to the AFC after the merge was completed. Art Modell said, "Unbeknownst to us, Carroll had cut his own deal." And if we really want to dive into this, Rosenblum even died in a mysterious way. The medical examiner said he drowned, although some people believe he was actually murdered due to his gambling ties. He was known to never swim alone. His son once said, "It's just a gut feeling I have long held that something else happened." If he went out alone that day, he was breaking a habit of a lifetime. So you can probably see where this is all going. With that, we bring in our accuser. Now we have the story about the game itself from 1967 #1 overall pick, Colts Pro Bowl defensive end Bubba Smith. He said, "No, the Jets were not that good. Something was happening and I didn't know what it was. We were inside the 20-yard line 5 times in the first half and came away with no points. That's not characteristic of the Colts. It was the quarterback, Earl Morrall. Carroll Rosenblum bet $3 million on the Jets. The only person he needed was Morrall. And he had 3 interceptions in the first half, all inside the 20. Then we run the flea flicker and wide receiver Jimmy Orr is standing there by himself and waving his arms. He was the primary receiver and Morrall never looked at him. He didn't even have to know where he was. Just throw the ball down that way. Jimmy was so wide open. Bubba isn't the only one who noticed Morrall's blatant error. You can clearly hear the announcers pointing out how open he was during the original broadcast. Even Coach Don Shula said at halftime, "The flea flicker is designed especially for Orr. Morrall is supposed to look for him. What in hell is happening?" Bubba further explained his conspiracy. If you read the terms of the merger, if the AFL didn't establish credibility by the end of 3 years, the terms of the merger were null and void. You're talking the difference between millions and billions of dollars. The line opened up at 18 and went down to 15 or something like that because a big bet had been placed on the game. And I know where that bet came from. It came from Baltimore. Even if you think Bubba Smith is crazy and Rosenblum and Morrall are innocent, the Jets' win still guaranteed millions and eventually led to billions in the NFL owners' pockets. Former Chiefs owner Lamar Hunt said that right after Super Bowl III, Rozelle leaned over to him and whispered, "This is the best thing that could have happened to pro football." Those who side with Bubba would probably say that Rosenblum could have made a deal with the commissioner to lose the game for the future of the league. Obviously, there are counter-arguments to these suspicions. First off, Jets head coach Weeb Ewbank previously coached the Colts to multiple NFL championships, so he obviously had success against NFL opponents and was facing his old team. He came in with a great game plan and they did a good job controlling the clock. Plus, the Jets players felt disrespected and were confident they could pull off the upset. Bubba believed the Jets were not that good, but Jets right tackle Dave Herman did a fantastic job of hindering Bubba himself. And with Morrall, although he had a great year and was named NFL MVP, he certainly could have just been having a bad day. At times, it sure seemed like he was trying to find open guys, but he had some bad turnovers on some key plays, and the Jets defense took advantage every time. Plus, later in the game, Johnny Unitas came in and threw an interception as well. He didn't look particularly strong against the Jets secondary, although he was coming off a season-long injury. It's also noteworthy that Don Shula never bought Bubba's theory. And above all else, the next year, the Chiefs came out of the AFC and they won Super Bowl IV. So maybe the leagues weren't nearly as imbalanced as people thought. No matter what you believe, Super Bowl III remains one of the greatest stories in NFL history. The question is, was that story manufactured out of the league office? The next few decades of the NFL weren't without controversy, but our next stop in this video takes us all the way to Super Bowl 37. If someone were to rig the Super Bowl, then maybe the least likely candidate would be a head coach. But somehow there's a game in NFL history where multiple players have accused their head coach of losing on purpose. This is the story of Bill Callahan and the Super Sabotage. In the 1998 offseason, Raiders owner Al Davis hired up-and-coming offensive guru John Gruden as head coach. The Raiders hadn't made the playoffs in 5 years, but things were looking up when Gruden came to town. By the turn of the century, he turned journeyman quarterback Rich Gannon into an MVP candidate. And with a much-improved defense, the team made the AFC Championship. The next season, in 2001, ended in yet another playoff heartbreak, And by this time, Gruden and Al Davis were on track for an amicable divorce. On February 18th, 2002, the Raiders completed a blockbuster trade, sending Gruden to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for a stockpile of valuable draft picks and $8 million. A few weeks after the trade, offensive coordinator Bill Callahan was promoted to head coach in Oakland. Callahan made his jump to the NFL in 1995 as an O-line coach for the Eagles. That same year, Gruden was hired as Eagles offensive coordinator. When Gruden then got the head coaching gig in Oakland, he brought in Callahan as his coordinator. So in 2002, Callahan took over the team at quite possibly the perfect time. Gruden's system had been fully implemented, they had the right players for the scheme, and they were overflowing with talent. Gannon was named NFL MVP behind one of the best O-lines in the league, while throwing to 2 Hall of Fame wide receivers in Tim Brown and Jerry Rice, considered the best receiver to ever play. Rice was 40 years old, but still put together a 1,200-yard season. Then there was Charlie Gardner, a talented dual-threat running back, and Jerry Porter, a young receiver having a breakout year. On the other side of the ball, you had a top 10 defense led by Hall of Famers Rod Woodson and Charles Woodson. After going 11-5 and stomping the Titans in the AFC Championship, the Raiders were on their way to San Diego to face none other than John Gruden's Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Super Bowl 37. On Monday morning, Callahan handed the team a booklet titled Game Plan to a Championship. It featured a set of run-dominant plays, and they believed they could outpower the Bucs' defensive line with the size of their offensive line. Plus, the Bucs' defense had been absolutely feasting on the passing game all year, so the plan made sense. They practiced that on Wednesday and Thursday. According to players, it was a great week of practice, and the team had fully bought into the strategy. Then on Friday morning, 2 days before the Super Bowl, Callahan walks into the building and basically says, "Never mind, forget the run game plan, we're gonna throw it 60 times. Rod Woodson said it was a shocker to everybody. He was in such disbelief that he dropped his book during the meeting. Tim Brown couldn't believe it either.
When things are changed and you know, you go from one offense to another offense, it just, it didn't make any sense for that to be happening at that particular point.
Some people have theorized that Al Davis got a hold of the game plan late in the week and wanted to continue with the Raiders' high-flying passing attack, but Brown believes that Davis had nothing to do with it. In fact, he said the change in plans was such a big deal that some of the players attempted to track down Davis on that Friday to let him know about Callahan's last-second change. One player in particular approached Callahan himself, begging him to not go through with the switch. And that player was Barrett Robbins, the All-Pro center in the midst of a career year, who come Saturday was nowhere to be found. Tim Brown said the team knew going into the big game that they had no shot. Part of that was the game plan change, but another part of it was one of their best players going missing. On Friday night, Barrett Robbins was dropped off at the team hotel just before curfew. When the team reported for Saturday meetings, though, Robbins had gone AWOL. It was the day before the Super Bowl, and not even his wife knew where he was. There was hope he would show up for a walkthrough at Qualcomm Stadium later in the day, but still, when the time came, there was no sign of Robbins. This team was now hours away from the biggest game in their lives, and they had a super distraction on their hands. It would be a news story any day of the week for a talented NFL player to suddenly disappear, but for it to happen the day before the Super Bowl, well, that's a whole new ballgame. It wasn't until Saturday night that Robbins was found crying by himself in a booth at a San Diego bar. Luckily, a couple Raiders fans recognized him and paid a taxi driver to take him back to the hotel. What they didn't know was that Robbins, from Friday night through Saturday, had escaped the team hotel and made a round-trip drinking binge in Tijuana, Mexico. The reason why? Well, in his mind, he was celebrating a Super Bowl victory. He somehow ended up back in San Diego, but has no memory of how it all happened. Later, he would admit that he lost his mind that weekend. It was just one of many times in his life that he experienced an episode like this. And in no way was he mentally okay to play on Sunday, so Callahan had him benched. Robbins was notably a smash-mouth player lauded for his run blocking. There's a theory some Raiders players share that Callahan's late strategy swap away from the run game was the trigger that set this episode off. On Friday, Robbins implored Callahan to keep the old plan with him having the on-field duty to make the protection calls. He said, "I don't have time to prepare for this. Please don't do this. You can't do this to me." But Callahan wouldn't budge. Things got even worse from there, with some players calling Callahan's bizarre action sabotage. Part of that also comes from Callahan keeping Gruden's audible calls, so the Bucs could quite literally predict the exact play call at the line of scrimmage. Even if Callahan honestly had a change of heart in the game plan, then why didn't he switch up Gruden's old audibles? One coaching blunder for the ages can be overlooked, but two in the same week before the championship is well deserving of an eyebrow raise.
Was it slow OC? Yeah. I told him right before. They're too predictable. They're too predictable.
Now we have to get to the motive. What motive could Callahan have had to throw the biggest game of his career? That's going to be a tough argument to make. This side of the theory revolves around three different factors. One, Callahan was hoping to get fired and be freed from Al Davis, who was well known to be one of the strongest personalities in all of NFL history, and certainly had a way of creating enemies. That could partially explain Callahan's dramatic outburst the next year where he called his team
the dumbest team in America.
And it didn't take long for Davis to fire Callahan after the 2003 season. Left guard Frank Middleton said he didn't think Callahan was happy on the Raiders, and the team wasn't happy with him as head coach. The next piece to this theory is Callahan getting the Nebraska job just days after the Raiders axing. That isn't too unusual in the coaching world, but it does signify that talks were most likely going on while Callahan was under contract as one of the lowest paid head coaches in the NFL. Nebraska, of course, was willing to pay him 50% more than Davis was. On top of that, the school signed him up for a 6-year contract. Back then, this job was looking like a very safe bet, with Nebraska being named national champion 3 times in the prior 10 years. You could argue that working in one of the best college football jobs was much better than being under the microscope of Al Davis. And you're getting paid way more too. Maybe Callahan even had money disagreements with Davis like Mike Shanahan did. Davis reportedly owed $250,000 to Shanahan, but never paid up. Things got real personal between those two, and Callahan had already seen what happened to his buddy Gruden when his next contract was coming around. Speaking of Gruden, Callahan in a way owed his position in the NFL to him, and it's been speculated that he would have followed Gruden to Tampa if the trade conditions had allowed Gruden to bring any assistants. On top of that, later in Callahan's career, Jay Gruden hired him as an assistant, so the trust between Callahan and the Gruden family is quite evident. Tim Brown would argue that bond is stronger than any bond between Callahan and the Raiders. He said Callahan had a big problem with the Raiders, hated the Raiders. He only came because Gruden made him come. Literally walked off the field on us a couple of times during the season when he first got there. Jerry Rice added substance to this claim while backing up Brown's sabotage accusations. Now we have multiple players in the Hall of Fame, going public with this seemingly outrageous claim. Even if Callahan was frustrated by Davis and he knew he had better opportunities, and he had an undying loyalty to Gruden, does that really surpass the personal glory and career-changing effects of winning a Super Bowl? The decision to change game plans and use old Gruden audibles was so mind-boggling that Brown and Rice could only believe it was done with malicious intent. But with the details publicly released right now, nothing sounds too convincing. There would have to be something else going on behind the scenes with Callahan for him to actually throw the Super Bowl. Now, without knowing all that was going on, the public had the Raiders favored to win the game. But when you watch the 48-21 shellacking, it sure looks like one defense knew the play calls, and one offense had no faith in itself after a catastrophic week of preparation. In hindsight, the Bucs were probably going to win no matter what. They had one of the best defenses of all time, Gruden knew the Raiders inside out, and they were a deserving champion. But that single week of disastrous measures for the Raiders will seemingly remain a mystery. It's fair to point out how Rich Gannon and other Raiders players have come to Callahan's defense since the accusations broke out. And of course, Callahan, as a current assistant coach in the NFL, has denied all suspicions. It's clear that Callahan's decision-making affected his team in every possible way. The question is, was it just a crucial coaching error, or was there something more to it? For our next major rigging accusation, we only have to move forward 3 years. This time, every football fan's usual suspects have come into play: the referees.
Back inside, he's inside the 20, the 15, the 10, the 5, touchdown Seahawks!
In 2005, the Seahawks lit up the NFL with the best offense in the league. At the head of this attack was MVP running back Shaun Alexander, who tied the single-season rushing touchdown record with 27 TDs. He couldn't have done that without a stacked offensive line containing 2 Hall of Famers. In tandem was Pro Bowl quarterback Matt Hasselbeck, who was having a career year of his own. The defense held opponents to just under 17 points per game, thanks in part to the play of rookie linebacker Lofa Tutupu. Seattle finished with the best record in the conference, going 13-3. Then they marched right through the NFC in the playoffs, capping it off with a 34-14 win over the Panthers to advance to the Super Bowl. Meanwhile, in the AFC, the defending champion Patriots were having a down year by their standards. The Colts and Broncos were looking like the teams to beat, and the Super Bowl participant out of the AFC did just that. The wildcard Steelers had talent all over the place. Troy Polamalu was hitting his stride with the first-team All-Pro selection of his Hall of Fame career. Joey Porter was in his prime and led a great linebacker unit. On offense, you had second-year quarterback Ben Roethlisberger coming off a Rookie of the Year campaign. He's playing behind a great offensive line, along with an emerging Willie Parker and veteran Jerome Bettis at running back. And finally, Hines Ward was one of the most feared receivers in the league. So you have a former expansion team making their first Super Bowl against one of the most decorated teams in the NFL. And as luck would have it, this game would be taking place in Detroit, just a 4.5-hour drive from Pittsburgh. That would be the theme for the week leading up to the big game. Detroit turned black and yellow, and it wasn't even entirely from traveling fans either. The city had adopted its own story for the game.
I didn't know Santa Claus was a Steelers fan.
Absolutely. Ho, 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 here we go. One for the thumb, baby.
With retirement looming and the game taking place in his hometown, Jerome Bettis became the headliner for this Super Bowl. He was getting featured in Time magazine and starring in Campbell's soup commercials. It felt like the Steelers had temporarily become Detroit's team. Bettis was being called the city's savior. He had promised to build up housing and a large entertainment complex in the city once his career was over. Anyone connected to him was getting interviewed. That includes even the vice principal at his old high school. On the Wednesday before the game, the Detroit mayor gave him the ceremonial key to the city and declared the week Jerome Bettis Week. Some people started calling the city Bettisburg. This was just about the closest thing the city had to a Lions Super Bowl, and with poverty and crime rates climbing quickly, they were hopping aboard the much-needed positivity bus. It's really no wonder why the city's leaders were pumping the Steelers. It was an incredible distraction from the real problems in Detroit. But even on the outside, the national media was all in on Bettis Week. The Steelers having 4 championships at this point and being one of the NFL's most successful teams ever, dwarfed the Seahawks in fan base size and team recognition. Seattle was more or less getting disrespected by the country's near exclusive focus on the Steelers. Football Outsiders founder and ESPN analyst Aaron Schatz said, "You don't want to think about conspiracies, but it just seemed like for 2 weeks, the league, ABC/ESPN, the city of Detroit, and the NFL wanted the Seahawks to just go away so the Steelers could have the title." By the way, come game time, Hasselbeck estimated that the stadium was 90% Steelers fans. And even though the Seahawks were the #1 seed and the Steelers were a wildcard team, Vegas still had the Steelers as favorites to win. A bit odd, but like I said previously, the Steelers did have the talent to at least defend that line. For this video, we're going to focus on 4 plays that caused the Seahawks players, coaches, fans, and even many neutral observers to question the intention of the officials. We begin in the first quarter. The Seahawks scored the first touchdown of the game, but it was called back for offensive pass interference. The push-off was very ticky-tacky, even if it technically follows the rulebook. John Madden was calling this game and said, "When you think of push-offs, that's not the kind you think about." This call really set the stage for the whole game. And to make matters worse, Julian Edelman's game-winning touchdown against the Seahawks in Super Bowl 49 had a very similar feel, and that one was not called for OPI. Our next play is the Roethlisberger goal line dive. This one was a 50-50 call. All the ball has to do is break the plane of the goal line. It really just depends on the angle you're looking at. That's how close it was. But it really hurt the Seahawks losing a borderline touchdown on one end and then giving up a borderline score on the other end. Maybe the weirdest thing was the side judge hesitating to call a touchdown at first. Fourth quarter now with the Seahawks down just 4. And this call is one of the few in NFL history that was so bad that the referee apologized for it years later. On the broadcast, Madden straight up said, "I didn't see holding." It also sent the Seahawks back from what would have been the 1-yard line. So another potential go-ahead touchdown was ripped away from Seattle. 3 plays after the holding call, Hasselbeck threw an interception and got called for a block below the waist. Only problem was, he was tackling the ball carrier. This call may not have had the immediate consequences of the other plays on this list, but it rates as maybe the most egregious. Madden's reaction was the officials saw something they didn't see. The Steelers got an extra 15 yards and put the game away with a final score. So the game ended 21-10. But with 2 potential Seahawks touchdowns and 1 Steelers touchdown all going in favor of Pittsburgh, that's what made Boston reporter Tom Curran say, "The game reeked of orchestration by the officials. It made you feel dirty by the time you turned it off." Seahawks head coach Mike Holmgren said, "We knew it was going to be tough going against the Pittsburgh Steelers. I didn't know we were going to have to play the guys in the striped shirts as well." Now, even with so many calls going against them, the Seahawks still wasted enough opportunities themselves where they arguably weren't deserving of the win in the first place. Hall of Fame left tackle Walter Jones might have summed it up perfectly, saying probably 75% we lost that game, and the rest we got robbed. Some would argue this was in the era of Tim Donaghy, the disgraced NBA referee caught gambling on games, which made anything possible for the NFL. And more gasoline was poured on the fire when it was discovered that the NFL's supervisor of officiating, Mike Pereira, had disappeared shortly after the game. With the backlash of officiating hitting the NFL immediately after Super Bowl 40, the league quickly sought their so-called counsel for this case. And that man would be Mike Pereira. Only problem was, they couldn't get in contact with him. NFL Senior Vice President of Communications Greg Aiello sent multiple emails to Pereira saying, "Where the hell are you?" Turns out, he was already on a plane to Costa Rica. Pereira insists that the vacation was scheduled ahead of time, and he's since come out and defended the referees. Now, he does admit that there were some controversial calls, but he didn't really see anything out of the ordinary. And he certainly doesn't buy into any theory where the NFL wants the more popular team or the better story to win. His little trip out the country did create a rule change, however, with high-ranking NFL employees no longer allowed to schedule vacations for the day after the Super Bowl. But like I mentioned before, NFL ref Bill Levy apologized years later for the holding and block below the waist calls. He said he will go to his grave wishing that he did better. If Levy were to be conspiring against the Seahawks, it's unlikely that he'd be saying sorry for the missed calls years later. Speaking of years later, the Seahawks took out Peyton Manning's Broncos in Super Bowl 48. The game felt like it was over before it even began, and Manning winning certainly would have been the better story. But of course, controversy would strike back in Manning's next Super Bowl when the wife of the game's replay assistant attended the game as a Broncos fan. More fuel to the fire, or just terrible oversight on behalf of the NFL? That's what's fun or extremely disturbing about these mysteries. Weird stuff happens in the most crucial moments. And in the end, sometimes the very people involved will scream bloody murder. What do you think? Were any of these Super Bowls actually fixed? Or is it nothing more than a great YouTube video?
Are you tired of all the pills in your medicine cabinet? I'm Linda Bamber Olson, the creator of the Wave Watch, a more natural approach with 1,000 frequencies for mind and body. People have used the Wave Watch for kidney stones, arteries, blood, immune system, vagus nerve, myocarditis, allergies, colds and flu, ADD and ADHD, strokes, Parkinson's, carpal tunnel, thyroid, Lyme disease, and so much more. Wave Watch has a 1-year manufacturer's warranty for defects and flaws, and you can also upgrade to an additional warranty for water damage and breakage. Are you tired of all your pills and endless trips to the pharmacy? Why not try the Wave Watch with 1,000 different self-care ideas and put your mind at ease?
Just go to wavewatch.com. At checkout, use the code Michelle100 to receive $100 savings on your purchase.